This happened to me when I was around 12, and it still makes me feel uneasy. My grandma lived in an old house on the edge of a small town, and I would stay with her for a few weeks every summer. One day, she introduced me to her friend, a woman named Mrs. Hensley. She described her as an old friend from years ago who just moved back to town. My grandma seemed really happy about it, so I didn't question it. One afternoon, Grandma sent me to Mrs. Hensley's house to drop off some fresh tomatoes. It was a little cottage a few streets over, and I remember it looked empty, curtains drawn, paint peeling, windows dusty. I knocked, but no one answered. I figured she was out, so I just left the tomatoes on the porch and went home. Later that night, Grandma was telling me stories about her childhood with Mrs. Hensley, like how they used to play in the fields and cause mischief around town. She talked about Mrs. Hensley as if she were there, sitting with us, and even paused like she was listening for Mrs. Hensley to respond. I thought it was odd, but maybe it was just old age making her a bit quirky. The next day, Grandma wanted to go visit Mrs. Hensley, so we walked to the cottage together. When we got there, the place looked even more abandoned. The windows were broken, and the porch was covered in dust, with my tomatoes still sitting there. Grandma was confused and kept calling out for Mrs. Hensley, but it was obvious no one lived there. When we got back home, Grandma was quiet, almost in a daze. That night, she told me she had something to show me. She pulled out an old photo album and pointed to a black and white picture of a young woman. "That's Mrs. Hensley," she said. I stared at it, confused, because I'd seen that same face around town sometimes in passing cars or in stores, but she always disappeared before I could get a closer look. Then my grandma said, almost to herself, "I always thought she'd moved away." She looked at me and said something I'll never forget. She passed away when we were young. I thought she came back to see me. After that summer, my grandma never mentioned Mrs. Hensley again, and that face I'd seen around town, I never saw it again, either.